1933. That's 62 years ago. One of the strangest events of my life. Now, I was a junior at Michigan State. I'd come home for the summer and was working at various jobs, earning a few dollars here, a few dollars there at the highway department or clerking in the store. But the big event of the summer of 1933 was the Chicago World's Fair, which was, of course, held in Chicago. And many, many people, millions of people, were getting to Chicago one way or another to take a look at that grand event. Now, Mother and Dad, and I believe Grace, had attended the fair. They had taken their car, family car, and gone up to Mackinac City, got on a passenger boat, and went down to Chicago, Lake Michigan, and the boat acted as their hotel. They attended the fair for probably about 3 days, and then came back. When they came back, they, of course, were very enthused about what they had seen. And I remember Dad saying to me, he said, "Gee, Harry," he said, "if there's any way that you can see that, along with your interest in history," he said, "you should see it." And so it was decided then, right then and there, that I would try to get down there. I had about $50 in cash, which was sufficient amount of money because I would bum down. And I had a connection in Chicago where I could stay free of charge for room and board. One of the boys at the fraternity house by the name of Murphy, his parents operated a truck farm just west of the city limits of Chicago. Had been there for several generations. The family raised fruits and vegetables, which they took into the various hotels and big restaurants in town on a daily basis in the summertime. And he let it be known to the fellows in the fraternity of East Lansing that if they came down, his parents had okayed that the kids could come and stay with them. They had a great big farm home, and also had several other small homes on that farm where people would come in and help during certain harvest seasons. They raised beans, they raised carrots, they raised rhubarb, they raised all types of vegetables for the big hotels, including cabbage, including lettuce, and rhubarb. And they had also large fields of corn, which were planted at various times and came due at various times. And corn was picked almost on a daily basis and trucked into the hotels in Chicago. That's how these people had made their living for a good number of years. So it was all set. I called this fellow by the name of Murphy and told him I was coming. He said, "Come on right ahead." He said, "And I'll be able to get time off and I'll go with you to the fair." So away I went. I bummed out of Rogers City, went by way of Alpena, Bay City, Saginaw, Flint, and got to East Lansing probably about mid-afternoon. This was in July, about July 25th or 26th in there. When I got to East Lansing, I went out to the fraternity house, SAE, Saginaw Island, and the place was closed. I kind of anticipated that, but I thought, well, maybe there's a chance that somebody would be there, not if I have a place to bunk. But not so the case. So I went back downtown in East Lansing and was just walking around figuring out what I should do. And I encountered a fellow by the name of Mason, who was on the faculty at Michigan State. He was a chemistry professor, and he was there that summer teaching a couple classes in chemistry. Now, I had Professor Mason for a year of chemistry. I'd entered school on a science program. The idea was that I would probably go to pre-med. Well, that wasn't to be, but I did take general chemistry, organic and inorganic chemistry from him for a whole year. And so I explained my situation to him, that I was on my way to Chicago and was just looking for a place to stay overnight. And he said, "Well," he said, "I got 2 bedrooms in my little apartment over here." He said, "You're welcome to stay with me." And I said, "Fine." So that evening I went over to his place, And sure enough, there was a bedroom all waiting for me. Well, it just so happened about 4 o'clock the next morning, about that time, I woke up and I had the darndest pain in my stomach that you could imagine. Stomach was swollen, and of course I was a little bit frightened about that situation. So I called to him, because the door was standing open, and he came in, and I explained to him and showed him. He said, "Oh boy," he said, "we got to get you to a doctor." He said, "Put on your pants and your shoes and your shirt," and he said, "We'll take you right down to Sparrow Hospital." He said, "They have an emergency room down there that's open 24 hours a day." So we got into his car, and down we went on Michigan up to Sparrow, went in the emergency room, and there were young doctors there, and nurses in that emergency room, and they put me up on a gurney and started examining me, and one of the young doctors said, "Boy," he said, "that looks like appendectomy to me." So they took some tests of blood, and then the other doctor said, "Well, now I tell you," he said, "the regular surgeon, one of the regular surgeons, is going to be here in probably 15, 20 minutes, because," he said, "he's got an early operation. And he said, we'll have him take a look at you just as soon as he comes in." And now understand that Mr. Mason was there with me in that emergency room. Well, that's probably about right. About 15 minutes, in comes this doctor, and they bring him in and have him take a look at me. He probed around a little bit, and he said, "Boy," he said, that's an appendix. He said, "That's got to get out of there," he said, "before it breaks, or if it hasn't broken." So he said, "Prepare this fella." He said, "Well, just as soon as I'm through the operation that I'm scheduled for," he said, "we'll take him in. Just get him all ready." I said, "Well," I said, "I don't know about paying you." He said, "We'll worry about that afterwards." But he said, "Right now," he said, where do you live?" And I told him, "Rogers City, Michigan." He said, "That's where your folks live?" I said, "Yes." Well, he said, "Notify him." So I told Mr. Mason who my parents were, what the address was, what the phone number was. And now I don't remember this part of it, whether he talked to him by phone or whether he sent him a telegram. I think he talked to him by phone. And when he came back, he said, "Well," he said, "I got a hold of your dad." And Dad said, "Go ahead, do what you have to do, and just send me the bill." And so that's what happened. Now I'll explain a little bit about that afterwards. I still have after the operation, of course, I was scheduled to stay in the hospital for a week, which I did. That was the way that they did those things in those days. And for 24 hours, or 48 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours, I had a special nurse. Well, everything went fine. Mason, as soon as the operation was over, sent a telegram to my dad from Lansing to Rogers City. And I have a copy of that telegram, which Dad received at that time from Mason. I still have the original. And then I also have the original handwritten note, which Dad returned in a telegram to him, saying that he thanked him for everything he was doing and would appreciate any other additional information that was necessary. But he could always contact them in Rogers City. Well, I got through the first day, all right, and now, the next day, the next morning, around probably about 9:30 in the morning, a fellow walks into the room that I recognized, a Mr. George Endress. Now, George Endress was a former neighbor of ours in Rogers City. He lived in the Ewell house after the Ewells left. He came to Rogers City to manage the P.H. Heft department store for Mr. Heft. And we got to know him just as you would any neighbors. He had a couple of daughters, one a couple of years older than I was and one a couple of years younger. And long about, maybe when I was still in high school, they left. And they went to Lansing, Michigan. And in Lansing, Michigan, he proceeded to open a little store for men's clothing, men's work clothes. And I was in that store. It was in an area, I think, around the Olds plant or the Rio plant. I'm not sure which. I haven't been able to locate that site since. But anyway, he sold men's clothing of all types: boots, shoes, socks, pants, coats, jackets, everything that you could think of for the man going to work in the big plants there at Lansing. And so he came in and said hello and glad to see me and so on and so forth. I didn't think to ask him anything about it at all, but I was glad to see him and just assumed in my own mind that apparently Dad had contacted the fella, because there was nobody else in Lansing that I knew of except the fellas who lived at the fraternity, and they weren't around, didn't know I was there. And so nothing happened. Then the next day, along about 9 o'clock again in the morning, he came in. And in the course of the conversation, this story unfolded. The previous day he had gone to his shop, went there early in the morning, usually about an hour, hour and a half before the shifts changed, so that he could take advantage of any fellas wanting clothing for his store. And he usually stayed there until about 9 o'clock when his assistant or clerk came, and then he would go and leave and have breakfast, and then come back. He said he was sitting there along probably about 7:30 in the morning in the back of his office. It was just nothing but a great big room. That's all it was, maybe about 25 by, I would say 25 maybe by 25, a square area. And just shelves and shelves of and tables of goods. And he had a little office in the back. There was a door in the back, and there was a window in the back that looked out of back against the alley. And he said he was sitting there, and there was no business. And he said, just kind of daydreaming. And he said, all of a sudden, he said, into his right ear came a voice. And that voice said, go to Sparrow Hospital. Somebody there wants to see you. He said, I kind of jumped up, looked around, and there was nobody there. He said, I looked out the back window, there was nothing there but my car. And he said, I just kind of said to myself, George, what did you hear? What was going on here? He said, it kind of startled me. And I thought, oh, it must be just kind of something happened. He didn't know what. So he said, I sat down again, and he said, I'll be darned if the same voice didn't come back into that right ear. Go to Sparrow Hospital. Somebody's to see you. Well, he said, I really got shook. Because he said, I turned around very fast, almost fell out of the chair, and he said there was nothing there. What in the world was going on? So he said, I just sat there, he said, kind of transfixed. He said, just wondering whether I was losing my mind. And so pretty soon my clerk came in along about 8 o'clock, 8:30. And I said to him, well, I'll be going out for a little bit. He said, I'll be back later on. He said, just take care of everything. So he said, I left. And I originally was going to just go down to the corner to a restaurant and have a cup of coffee and come back. And then I said, no, I'll go over to Sparrow Hospital. So he said, I took a ride over. He said it wasn't too far. And he said, I went in the front door, up to the main desk, and said to the clerk at the desk, I said, they gave my name. Is there anybody here that has asked for a Mr. George Endress? He said, I have a message that I was supposed to come here, that somebody wanted to see me. Well, she kind of looked around and rattled through some papers, and she said, gee, she said, I have. She said, nobody said anything about any message. And she said, well, what kind of a message did you get? Was it a telegram, or was it verbal, or no? He said it was verbal. He said, somebody just told me that. And he said, I have no idea what it could be, but he said, naturally, if somebody wants to see me, I want to be available. And he said again, are you sure that nobody has asked for me? Because he said the message was very, very clear. And he said, when she said no, he said, I just kind of almost melted my boots. I wonder what in the heck, George, what is wrong with you? And so he said, would you mind if I just sat down a little bit and thought about this thing? And she said, no, I have a chair over there, so icy as ice. Went down, sat in a big chair, and I was just looking outside, and I was kind of talking to myself. Well, now what in the world is going on? I was just about ready to shake off and go back to the shop, and I said, well, I'll go back and give it one more try. So I went back to the desk, and I said to the lady, I said that I told her who I was, where my address was, phone number, the whole thing. And I said, is there any chance that you could allow me to see who has entered the hospital in the last, say, 24 or 36 hours? She said, gee, she says, I doubt that we could do that. I doubt that very much. But she said, just a minute. So she walked around and went into a little door that opened off the back of the lobby and went in, and I could hear her talking to somebody. And pretty soon this other lady came out dressed in a RN uniform. And she said to me, she said, you're looking for somebody that told you to come to Sparrow Hospital. I said, that's right. And so she said to the clerk, well, she said, let them take a look at the last 24, 36 hours. So they had this register book, and they turned it around, and I looked, and there, right on the the previous page, was the name Harry Grambua, Rogers City, Michigan. And I said, I know that fellow. He used to be my neighbor in Rogers City. And she said, just a minute. So she turned the page over, and on the back part of that page, it apparently said, send billing to G.W. Grambua, Rogers City, Michigan. And she said, you know this fellow? I said, yeah. How old is he? Well, he's in college. You know his dad? Yeah. What's his dad's name? He said, his dad's George Grambua. He's a banker in Rogers City, Michigan. And she said, well, I guess you're right. She said, that's what it says here, to send the bill to George Grambua, Rogers City, Michigan. Well, I said to the fellow, I said to her, I said, do you think I could see him? She said, oh, yes. She said, I think so. So they called a little orderly or a little clerk or something like that, some little young man that was there. Said, would you take this man up to room, say, 205 or whatever it was at the time, to see Mr. Endress? So when George came in, I said, well, hi, Mr. Endress. Nice to see you. Now, he didn't tell me anything right then. And we just talked about various things and how I was coming with my operation, what I had, and so on and so forth. And he said, Harry, he said, I'll be back tomorrow. He said, I'll come back tomorrow morning and see you. Fine. He didn't tell me anything. And I wondered about it at the time. I said, how in the heck would that guy know I was here? And the only thing I could think of was, of course, that my dad had contacted him. I didn't know that my dad knew that he was in Lansing, but yes, he did. He probably did know that. But other than that, I couldn't figure out how Endress could possibly know that I was in Sparrow Hospital. So the next morning he came back, and he said, I'm going to tell you something. He said that scared the heck out of me. And then he proceeded to tell his story about this, how this voice and how it shook him up. And he said, it still kind of shakes me. He said, I still haven't told Mrs. Endress about it. He said, because I want to make darn sure that you're here. Well, I said, I'm here all right. I'll be here for another 5 days. And isn't that a phenomenon? He said he had no idea. No, he said that was the last thing that he was thinking about. He said he knew, of course, that I and my brother Herman had come to see him, because Herman was with me in the first year that I went down to Michigan State, and we stopped in to see this fella. And now, in the subsequent years, you might say that did I go and see him? I went to see him once after I got out, just the following week. After I was removed from the hospital, after a week, I stayed for another week with Mr. Mason. He said it was all right with him. And but he said before I went back home, the doctor wanted to check me again. And he said it was all right for me to walk around, not too much, but walk around. And so I did. I went during the next week. I did go to see Mr. Endress. And then in the subsequent years to that, he moved out of there. They moved to Ohio, and then finally I found out that he had moved to Florida. But what happened then was that after that, he said it still shook him up, and it shook me up that something like that would happen. He said he had no idea at all how something like that could have occurred, what had happened. He said he never thought of it. He never thought of Roger City, or never thought of Harry Grambua or George Grambua or any of those people, he said, until that occurred at that time. Well, after I got out of the hospital, I stayed another week with Mason, and then I remember I got a ride home all the way with Ed Hardees. Ed Hardees was from the Belknap Hardieses. He was a teacher in agriculture, had graduated from Michigan State, got his Ph.D., was teaching at the University of Wisconsin and other schools in the School of Agriculture. But I didn't know that he was teaching that summer at Michigan State. And just happened to run into him on that week that I had to still stay in town, and he explained to me that at the end of the week he was going to take a ride back up to Belknap. And if I wanted to go along, I could. Well, sure. That was right next to home. And so that's how I got home. But that phenomenon of that event certainly had to be one of the things that I always recall. I've told that story many times, but that's exactly what happened. Now, what is it? Is it extraterrestrial information? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine, but that's one of those things that did occur at that time. I still have a copy of the hospital bill from Sparrow Hospital dated 8/11/33. This was the final bill that came from the hospital to Dad. Harry Grambua, BEAU, Roger City, Michigan, charged to W. Grambua, BEAU. Room and board, 7 days, $6 a day, $42. Special nurses board, 3 days, $1.75. Laboratory, $3. Operating room, use of the operating room, $10. Anesthetic, spinal, $3. Medication, $3. The total hospital bill for the 7 days was $60.75. Then on the back of that bill, Dad had written in his own handwriting, here's the total of the affair. Hospital, $60.75. Dr. Snyder, the man who did the operating, Dr. Lemoyne Snyder, one of Lansing's leading surgeons. I didn't know that at the time, but I had the best. $125. His assistant, Dr. Snell, $10. And Mrs. Perrin, the nurse, $10. The total hospital bill was $205.75. Now, I have a copy of that. The original I gave to Sparrow Hospital. A couple of years ago, I ran into it, and my brother George, who lives in Lansing, is a volunteer worker. Spends a couple days a month doing volunteer work at the hospital, and so I gave him that original, and he took it and he gave it to their collection of history. I think Sparrow Hospital is going to celebrate its 100th year this summer. And it says here, appendectomy, July 26, 1933, Harry, age 21. Isn't that strange? And I also have the Western Union telegram sent by Mason to my dad, July 27th, 1933. It says here, Harry came through operation in fine shape. Everything okay. I'm writing you details. O.N. Mason. And I also have a copy of the telegram that my dad returned to Mason. July 27, 1933. It says, thanks for information. Anything that you may do for Harry will be greatly appreciated. G.W. Grambua. Now, I'm not sure as to just exactly where at that time in 1933 that the telegraph office was in Rogers City. It could have been at the Brooks Hotel if the Brooks Hotel was built in 1933. I'm not quite sure as to what year that was. But that is the story of that very special occasion and special event. I might say that in the fall of the year I returned back to Michigan State, and I went past Sparrow Hospital the other day when I was down Lansing with George. A tremendously different affair, just a fantastically big place at the present time. But I always held fond memories. Now, there's one interesting thing I'd like to add in here about Dr. Snyder, the man who operated on me. He was certainly one of the best-known surgeons in Lansing at that time. I wasn't aware of that at that time, but nevertheless, I found out since. He was also, as a sideline or as a hobby, he was a criminologist. And he worked with police departments and other detectives in investigating deaths. And he also worked as a criminologist with a well-known author of that time, Earl Stanley Gardner, who wrote detective stories. Earl Stanley Gardner had developed a group of individuals, including criminologists and other lawyers and attorneys, and they investigated cases where people had been convicted on suspicious evidence. And in a few instances, they sprung people out of prisons, showing that the evidence was improper. Now, Snyder, apparently, as also a pathologist, criminologist, had developed a technique using the organs of the body to determine very closely the time of death of the individual. And that became used in the criminology departments of the various police areas, and detectives used it, and pathologists used it. I don't know just what the technique is, but it was called the Snyder method, the Lemoyne-Snyder method of determining time of death by body organs. And in the recently held and still going on O.J. Simpson trial in California, about 6 months ago, or when the trial first started, Marcia Clark, who was one of the prosecutors, was questioning a criminologist on the stand. And she said to the criminologist on the stand, she said, did you use the Snyder method in determining the time of death? And he said, yes. She said, the Lemoyne-Snyder method? And he said, yes. Now, it just so happened, when I listened to that, I almost fell out of the chair. I called Martha, or called George, and Martha answered the phone. I said, did you hear you watching the Simpson trial? She said, yes. Did you hear what I heard? And she said, yes. Isn't that something? Because I had told George and Martha that story. In fact, I probably told everybody in the family that story at one time or another. But isn't it strange how after all these years that story came back, and that's what is prompting this right now. You know, that doctor's name being brought up in the Simpson trial. That is the method that he used. Now, there are other pathologists, of course, lots of them that were mentioned there, but it just happened that his was named specifically. Now, while we have a little room left on the tapes, I'm going to get into a little different subject. I have been asked by Treese and possibly record some of my remembrances of my long association with the schools here in Rogers City. And so I'll try to go back and think of some of the things that occurred to me over that period of time. Now, it is true that I spent some good number of years as a student and as a teacher with this school system. I had the normal K-12 or 13 years in the elementary, and then I had 38 years as a teacher, as a principal, and as a superintendent. And if you add 5 years of college on top of that, I had about 56 years altogether in education. Teacher, administrator, student. So I have a kind of a fair idea of what takes place. Now, I started out and attending school in the year 1917-18. And at that time, I went to the old, what we call the yellow school, the wooden building. And when I first went there in 1917-18, that was a 4-room building. 2 big rooms up, 2 big rooms down. Those are big rooms, probably about 1,000 square foot each. And in addition to the cloakroom areas. On the second floor, there was a little principal's office also. Now, at that time, of course, there was more and more kids were coming in, so at the end of that term, or end of that winter term, they started to add 4 more rooms to that building. And so 4 rooms were added, 2 up, 2 down. And that is the building that all of the kids attended. On the second floor, of course, off the second floor, there was a large enclosed fire escape also came off of one of the rooms. Now, previous to the time that it became an 8-room building, the toilets were outside. When they added the addition in 1918-19 in that area, then, of course, the toilet system was put into the basement area. And they improved the furnace department and became a much more efficient system. Now, immediately, that was for the elementary building. Now, right across the street, right across Michigan Avenue, that was the location. Now, I might say about that old wooden building. That wooden building, which was first occupied in 1902, was originally built by P.H. Heft as a school for the Lutheran Church, a Lutheran school building. And after he got the building built, the way he wanted it built, he offered to sell it to the congregation, and for $3,000, and the congregation turned it down and said it was too much money. So he just turned around and offered it to the public school, who we knew were desperately in need of room. And so they bought it and immediately started to use it in the fall of 1902. Now, a few years after that, of course, as the enrollment increased, then, of course, they built another building across the street, right across Michigan Avenue, and that was what we call the old red brick building. It became the high school. And then they divided the groups in the old wooden building. They put K through 4, and in that middle building, or the new high school, they put 5 through 12. And it became the official high school. There were 2 self-contained rooms there, the 5th and 6th grade, but all the rest was turned over to high school purpose, for high school use. Now, in that building, in 1913, 10, 12, and 13, when it was built, at a contract price of $14,000. You imagine that much space. It was built for probably the cost of about $1 a square foot. Today it would cost you $1 million. But nevertheless, that's the way the things went in that day. Now, that building had the equivalent of 3 full floors. In the basement, there were 3 large classrooms, then the toilet system and the janitor system, lunchrooms. And on the first floor were 3 large classrooms, about 900 square foot each, and a big hallway. They went out to the front of the room, which was used as the typing room. And on the top floor, or what we would call the second floor, was a large assembly hall, probably about 45 by 50, a big, big room that held probably about 125 kids. In addition to that, there were 2 large classrooms, plus a superintendent's office and a library. And in the middle area was the cloakroom, or clothes racks, where we hung our clothes. Now let's just for a minute get back to the elementary building when I started. This would be the fall of 1917. Lillian Dedman was the teacher. Lillian Dedman was out of Alpena, and most, I think all 6 kids had her as a kindergarten teacher. It just so happened that the year I came in, I can still picture this. I can still see every kid in that class. Mother said I had a photographic memory, but I actually can see all the kids that came in there. There were 106 kids that reported for kindergarten. I talked to H.H. Gilpin afterwards. He said they were just floored what to do. But he said they finally made adjustments. There probably were maybe about 10 or 12 kids that were just too young. They were not even 5 years old, so those kids were sent back. Then there were probably about another, he said, 6 or 7 kids where they were just, even though they were 5, 6 years old, they were just so immature, had been so much probably babied, or single-family kids, so thoroughly spoiled that they just could not adjust. And so they were persuaded to go and wait another year. And then they took the rest of those kids, they took about 8 or 10 of them, and they just deliberately moved them into the first grade. Now, well, I said, how did you deliberately move those kids into the first grade? He said, well, some of those kids were very, very sharp, and he said some of those kids could read just almost as well as some of the kids in the first grade. They knew their alphabet, they knew their numbers, and so we tried it. And in most cases, we were right. They did eventually fit into very well. And I know some of those kids graduated a year before me in high school. They stayed a year ahead all the time, so I guess they probably knew what they were doing. Now, but nevertheless, to get back to that, the kindergarten were the usual phonics studies and the beginnings of reading, the beginnings of writings. One interesting thing I remember about that kindergarten is that we all had a slate board. Slate board was probably about 12 by 12 or something like that. And that is where we practiced our first ABCs. The alphabet was listed on a big board, on a big piece of paper in front of the room, just like you see them today, the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s. And that's where we practiced our first writing, was on those slate boards. You had a small piece of slate, which looked like a piece of chalk, and you wrote with this slate against the slate, and it made a mark. 1, 2, 3, A, B, C. And then you had a little damp cloth, which was nothing more than a little piece of toweling that had been dipped in water, and you could erase that slate and make it clean, and then you started over again. We weren't given paper to write on not right first. No, that took a little while. We wanted to make sure that they didn't waste too much paper, because paper was expensive. And then eventually, I don't know how long it took, maybe 2, 3 months that we got rid of the slates. And then they handed us a nice big sheet of paper that had some lines on it. These were quite spacious lines. They were probably about 1 inch apart. And then we were given pencils. No, first of all, we were given a crayon, just an old Crayola. And then we practiced with that for a short period of time to kind of follow the lines. And then later on, all of a sudden, we were all handed the famous yellow pencil, which is a standard throughout the United States, that yellow pencil, sharpened by a pencil sharpener. And isn't it strange? You know, they tell the story about how come the yellow? The yellow was a standard color for pencils in the schools all across the nation. It still is today. Now, you can buy pencils in every color under the sun, but most of the pencils that they use in the public schools that they buy in quantity, which are furnished, are yellow. The story is that the pencil, as such, was developed by the Chinese. Now, whether that's true or not, I mean, it's a good story. And that pencil, of course, doesn't contain any lead, as that's graphite. They say that the Chinese discovered a way to solidify that graphite. They compressed it between a couple pieces of cedar, and they put it into the form of a pencil. And then they found out that worked pretty well, so what they did, they colored that pencil yellow, because yellow was the color of the Chinese royal family. And the first pencils that were made, according to the story, were given to the royal family of China. Now, other people credit the pencil to the Indians. Other people credit to the people that came from the country what we call Baghdad. I meant Baghdad, the country of Iraq, where Baghdad is. But nevertheless, it's a good story as far as the yellow pencil is concerned, but you certainly remember the yellow pencil. All right, now to get back. In the kindergarten, I had a teacher named Lillian Dedman. She was out of Alpena originally, and after she left, she lived in Alpena for many years, and I saw her on various occasions. She had a son called Austin Dedman. He ran a music store, and he was also a piano tuner, and I used to hire him when I was superintendent to come and tune the pianos in the building. And we often talked about his mother teaching in Rogers City. Now, in the first grade, I had a teacher by the name of Margaret Moore. And while she was here, she married a man named Leo Kuhlman. He was out of the Leopold Kuhlman family, and they lived here for a period of time, and then they moved to Detroit, and the Kuhlmans down there became very, very successful builders. In fact, one of the products that they developed in building was the spring air floor, which is in the new Rogers City High School. That was developed by that family, and it's become known throughout all the country as one of the, the floor has a very, very soft touch in playing basketball. And now Margaret Moore lived up into her 90s. I used to correspond with her. I saw her last at the time of the dedication of the new high school in '64. And I do correspond occasionally with her daughter, who lives in Texas. Then in the first grade, I had a teacher by the name of Kars, K-A-R-S, Wilhelmina Kars. Then in the third grade, I had a teacher by the name of Feen Campbell. She married John Sibley, who was a teacher in the math department, then later became principal, as you know, in 1928. And then in the fourth grade, I had a teacher by the name of Doris Giroux. Now, after she left here, she went and lived in Alma for a good number of years. Then in the fifth and sixth grade, I had a well-known person that you all remember as Dora Brady. Dora was out of the UP Ironwood area, and her maiden name, she was an Italian, Dora Zanella. She married a Vince Brady, who came out of Sault Ste. Marie and was one of the shovel operators down here at the quarry. And then in 1924, I moved into the high school area. Now, in the high school, ordinarily, everybody from the 7th through the 12th grade had a general assembly upstairs on the second floor of one great big room where they were just lined up by classes, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So naturally, you knew everybody that was in high school. It didn't make any difference which grade they were in, you knew those people, even though there was a 6-year age difference between those. In fact, even the kids in the 5th and 6th grade who were in self-contained rooms knew everybody in high school. So it was very common to know who was there, who hadn't been there. But so you actually probably, a kid that was in the 5th grade probably knew who was in the 12th grade. So you got, and that covers quite a bit of territory. So now, getting into high school. I thought probably we'd just run over some of the faculty people that I had. Some of these people you would remember. Maybe you had some of them you didn't, but you heard about them. Gertrude Fiegel was the teacher in the history department. Now, the history department at that time was a little different than it is now because history was taught as a year of ancient history and then a year of modern history. Went from the early to the modern period. Then there was a year of American history, and then in the senior year you took a half year of economics and a half year of U.S. government. And then another teacher was on her. And when I was going to the University of Michigan, she still lived there with her in the family home. And I used to go and see her once in a while when I was going to summer school. Then there was a teacher by the name of Dorothy Baker. She taught various classes in English in the high school. Then there was John Sibley. John Sibley was a math teacher. He was out of Escanaba, had gone to school at Alma, and had come up to, right after the war, came up here as a teacher in the math department. I had him for algebra, advanced algebra, geometry, solid geometry, trigonometry. Now, also, in 1928, in the fall of 1928, he became high school principal. The principal when I first moved in there, into the high school building, in 24 and 25, was a man by the name of Milton Young. He taught science, chemistry, and physics, and then he also, his wife was also on the faculty, and she taught English, and she taught debate team. Debate was big in high school.